Welcome to Conversations on Healthcare. This week we welcome Dr. Howard Fillit, co-founder and chief science officer of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, on promising new therapies in a new era of Alzheimer's research. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Masselli and Margaret Flinter.
As we catch up with loved ones during the holiday season, we might notice our elderly parents or relatives have aged a bit more. Are they showing signs of dementia? The experts say the holidays are an important time to recognize such changes.
Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia now, but more than ever, there's hope because of promising innovations. Here to share his insights is Dr. Howard Fillit. He's the co-founder and chief science officer of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation.
Dr. Fillit, welcome to Conversations on Healthcare.
Thank you. Nice to be here with you.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I was shocked at the number. 6.5 million Americans aged 65 and older are living with Alzheimer's. And there are many worthy researchers, universities, and advocacy groups in this space. Why was the Alzheimer Drug Discovery Foundation started, and what does it focus in on?
Well, we're a unique foundation in the sense that we have a very clear and very fine-tuned mission, which is to accelerate the development of new drugs for Alzheimer's disease. And basically that's all we do since 1998, when we were established by the Estee Lauder family, who saw the great need for translating basic research into Alzheimer's disease that had gone on for the prior 20 years or so. It was very timely to begin funding the risky effort in developing new drugs, and it's obviously hard, but we're making a lot of progress.
Well, Dr. Fillit, November is Alzheimer's Awareness Month, and so often, I think both in our daily lives and in healthcare, we hear elderly people say that they don't want an official diagnosis. They don't want to be evaluated because there is no cure. But share with us, why is getting a diagnosis, and maybe an early diagnosis, so important?
Sure, that's a great question. I get asked all the time. I'm a geriatrician, so I specialize in the care of elderly people for the past 40 years or so. So I've been doing this a long time. The majority of my practice efforts are in people with Alzheimer's disease. And I like to say that I've never met a patient or a family with Alzheimer's disease that I couldn't help. I think that despite the fact that we don't have really effective therapeutics, I do believe we're going to have them in the next 5 years or so. But even if we do, we're going to still need to care for people. And a good example of what happens when people don't get an early diagnosis is that very often catastrophic things happen. So people that are undiagnosed with Alzheimer's, that have significant cognitive impairment, can wander, they can get lost, they can fall and break a hip. They end up in the hospital for a variety of reasons, such as poor management of diabetes and hypertension and infections. And also caregiver stress. Let's not forget that while there's roughly 6 million people with Alzheimer's, there's probably 15, 20 million caregivers for those people around the country and around the world. And part of our job as physicians, I do believe, is counseling families on how to take care of their loved ones so that the caregivers themselves don't become depressed and at risk for hospitalization and so on. So the other thing is that early diagnosis is critically important for our research efforts. Less than 5% of people with Alzheimer's disease participate in clinical trials. It's very hard to find people. But with new diagnostic tests, we can identify people with Alzheimer's disease 20 years before they become symptomatic, before their first memory problems arise. And what that means is that today we can do prevention. Then there are clinical trials going on right now for prevention of Alzheimer's disease, studying people that have the pathology in their brain based on new diagnostic tests that our foundation has helped to develop, and then entering those people into clinical trials to prevent the onset of symptoms. So there's really a lot of excitement in the field right now, over 120 drugs in development, and about over 350 clinical trials going on around the world. It's a very exciting time. We have diagnostic tests on the market, and I could go on, but I probably should shut up right now and wait for your next question.
No, I thought that was a very thoughtful and comprehensive answer, and I think will encourage many people to take action. You know, your organization is an enthusiastic supporter and investor in blood-based biomarker research. I'm wondering for our audience, what exactly is that? How does it work, and where is it available?
Well, biomarkers are critical to clinical care and drug development. And I'd like to take the example of cholesterol. Cholesterol in the 1950s was discovered as a risk factor for heart disease. Nobody knew how it worked or why it worked. It came out of what we call epidemiological studies, looking at risk factors for heart disease. And then it took about 30 years for the first statins to come to market. And those statins actually were developed because they were designed to lower cholesterol with the theory that if you lowered cholesterol, you could prevent a second heart attack. And that worked, actually. So the development of the first statins would have been impossible if it wasn't for the development and the recognition of cholesterol as a risk factor for heart disease. And we're at the same stage today. We discovered that the plaques in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease have a protein called beta amyloid. Beta amyloid became one of the first targets of drugs for Alzheimer's back in the 1980s. We've been working on it about 30 years, just like heart disease, worked on it about 30 years. And just in the last few months, we had the first accelerated approval by the FDA for a drug to modify the disease and remove the beta amyloid. What we needed was better biomarkers, because the only way that we could detect beta amyloid in the brain was either by brain biopsy or autopsy. And most of my patients didn't want an autopsy just to get a diagnosis. That's a bad joke. But we were involved in the development of the first diagnostic test brought to market and approved by the FDA, which is an amyloid brain scan. And that amyloid brain scan is used almost uniformly around the world now in clinical trials to develop new drugs. And we also have, for the first time during the past year or two, the marketing of a blood test for Alzheimer's, which is incredible. If you had said to me 5 years ago or 10 years ago that there would be a blood test for Alzheimer's disease, I would have been astounded. But we've invested in that through a company called C2N. The blood test is now available in 49 states. We're still waiting for New York, which has the strictest regulations for having blood tests on the market. And there are many new blood tests that are going to be coming to market, making the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease more precise, less expensive, and more accessible and less invasive to people. The blood test will be part of clinical care of people with memory disorders in old age.
Wow. Well, that is some very exciting news, Dr. Fillit, and thank you for sharing that with us. You know, Mark and I are very engaged in the primary care space, and particularly community health centers. And of course, health disparities are a front and center concern for us. And as in so many areas, we understand that there's really very significant health disparities among different racial and ethnic groups when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. I think we've read Black Americans twice as likely as white Americans to have Alzheimer's, Hispanics 1.5 times more likely. I'm not sure that those are exactly precise, but what's the basis of these health disparities, and how are you organizing the research agenda to address them within the clinical work that you're doing?
Sure. Well, the most honest answer is we don't know. The answer to your question about how or why Blacks and Latinos, for example, or Hispanic communities are at greater risk. But we do know there is greater risk. I think probably it's related to common medical comorbidities that are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline in old age, and particularly diabetes and hypertension. And we know that hypertension is clearly a risk factor for cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease in old age, certainly for dementia, as is diabetes. And so the fact that these common comorbidities, and something like 65% of people over 65 have hypertension and 30% have diabetes, and the combination of the two is particularly devastating to the brain. It may be that that hypertension is, for example, more common in Blacks, and in underserved communities, these comorbidities that are actually kind of difficult to manage effectively get less well managed in underserved communities, and so create more a risk for cognitive decline, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease in old age. It's very clear that effective management of diabetes and hypertension, particularly hypertension, can reduce the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And so what we need to do is improve our primary care, as you mentioned, to make sure that these common comorbidities, including atherosclerosis, by the way, that if we can improve the management of those, then we would reduce the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease particularly. And this was recently shown, as we've seen in the US, that the declining prevalence, I should say incidence, I'm sorry, the declining incidence of heart disease in America has been associated with a decline in the incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's, which kind of proves that by managing vascular risk factors, we can have an impact on the occurrence of dementia. And I think that's really the main reason why we're seeing these disparities. And we need also, another big thing is we need to better recruit underserved communities into clinical trials, because over the last 20, 30 years, the vast majority of people in clinical trials have been Caucasian people.
Doctor, our organization is part of the All of Us research project. We were in there and on the initial setting up of that, and I think you're absolutely right. Such an important effort to try to get the population that looks like the rest of America into these clinical trials. So thanks for reminding us of that. But I want to focus in on some things that have happened over the past couple of years. The FDA approved an Alzheimer's drug, but it's been denied Medicare coverage. However, another group of companies reported encouraging results for their drug. There's also some progress with a nasal vaccine for Alzheimer's. I wonder if you could take us through where we are on the pharmaceutical front, both successes and some stumbles along the way. Well,
we've had many failures since 1980, and the last full drug approval that we had for Alzheimer's was in 2003. It's almost 20 years ago. The drug you're referring to, aducanumab or Aduhelm, from Biogen, did go through a controversial review process. It ultimately received what's called an accelerated approval from the FDA, which is kind of an interim decision based on the idea that the drug clearly showed that it could remove the amyloid plaques from the brain using the brain scan that I mentioned earlier that our foundation was critical in developing. And so we showed that the Biogen, for example, showed that the drug actually worked to do what it was supposed to do, which was to remove the amyloid plaques from the brain as measured on these brain scans. And the other drugs that are in development, drugs from Lilly called donanemab, drugs from Eisai Biogen called lecanemab, drugs from Roche called gantenerumab, they all do something similar, which is to remove these amyloid plaques from the brain. The big question about what's called the amyloid hypothesis is, if you remove the plaques from the brain, does it slow the rate of decline of cognitive impairment? And it's looking to me like it does. The question is whether the decline that we're seeing, the slowing of the rate of decline that we're seeing with these drugs is clinically meaningful. And for that reason, I think the drug got an accelerated approval based on the idea that removing the plaques reasonably predicts that patients would have a slower rate of decline. But it's not a definitive answer. And I think what we're going to see is these other drugs coming down the pipeline that I mentioned, probably getting accelerated approval. And maybe if the results are even more robust than what we've seen so far with some of the other drugs that are anti-amyloid drugs, maybe we'll get a full approval. Imagine where cancer was in 1950. We didn't have any approved drugs. We were experimenting. We didn't know what to do. And today, cancer is a chronic disease that's manageable in most cases. We're just on the cusp of a new era of drugs for Alzheimer's disease. These approvals are really exciting because, if we slow it down by 30%, well, we want to slow it down by 100%, but that's where we're going. We're using biomarkers, what we call precision medicine, like in cancer, combination therapy, like in cancer. I think the fact that getting back to your question, that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid did not approve payment for the drug is somewhat unfortunate and somewhat understandable. I think the issue that Medicare had in paying for the drug was one about, as I mentioned, clinical meaningfulness, the potential of these drugs to be utilized when it wasn't clear how effective they were, and there were side effects, I think gave caution to Medicare to give what's called a coverage with evidence development, which is also kind of an interim decision. They said to the companies, they're saying to the companies, we want you to prove that these drugs really work and that they're effective and they're safe enough for us to pay for it. It was unprecedented that Medicare refused to pay for a drug that was FDA approved, but that's a whole another discussion that we'd need to have.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, Dr. Fillit, Mark mentioned the All of Us project a few moments ago, and you just referenced precision medicine. So I want to talk about genetics a little bit. We understand you're investing in a unique treatment approach that targets the underlying genetics of Alzheimer's disease, and that this approach could generate levels of a gene that might be protective for those with a pre-existing genetic risk for Alzheimer's. Share with us the latest on this research.
Sure. Well, it's been known for many, many decades that if you have a close family member with Alzheimer's, then you have increased risk, a parent or a sibling. And it wasn't really understood till about 30 years ago. A gene and a protein called apolipoprotein E was discovered to be a major risk factor and remains today really the major genetic risk factor for what we call sporadic Alzheimer's disease, the kind that occurs in old age. And there's three kinds of this gene, ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. About 70% of people in the community have ApoE3. So that's thought of as the neutral risk of this gene, which, by the way, plays a critical role in cholesterol metabolism and does a whole host of other things, modulating inflammation in the brain. And it's really understood biologically now why ApoE is a risk factor. So people have, about 20% of people in the community have an ApoE4 gene, either one from mom or dad, or two, one from mom and one from dad. And the people that have one ApoE4 have about a 5 times increased risk of Alzheimer's disease in old age. And people that have two ApoE4s have about a 15 times increased risk of Alzheimer's disease in old age. And that's huge. So even though only about 20% of people in the community have an ApoE4, about 60% of people with Alzheimer's disease have an ApoE4. Now, people that have an ApoE2 actually have a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. So it's telling us that something really important is going on in this biology of apolipoprotein E. And we understand a lot about the biology, but it's very hard to go from just understanding the biology and the genetics to actually developing a drug that would treat that biology. And we've, through our foundation, tried many different ways. But because ApoE plays so many different roles in the brain, targeting any one of those roles is probably not going to be good enough. So we worked with investigators, particularly Dr. Ron Crystal, who's the chairman of the Department of Genetics at Weill Cornell here in New York. And he is an expert in developing gene therapy. And we spun out, we invested in the spin out of a company called Lexeo out of Weill Cornell, and they're developing gene therapy to treat this ApoE4 problem by putting the ApoE2 gene, which is protective, into a non-infectious virus, which is a typical way of doing gene therapy, and then injecting that non-infectious virus into the brain of people who are ApoE4, and seeing if that injection of that virus actually stimulates the production of ApoE2. So the theory is that if we could turn these ApoE4 people into being able to produce ApoE2, we would offset the risk of ApoE4. And this has been approved by the FDA. A small number of people have been treated with this virus gene therapy, and it's been shown that these people actually make ApoE2 in their spinal fluid. So it's a really exciting approach, and we're very hopeful that this will move forward and have a big impact on preventing and treating Alzheimer's disease.
Well, that's very exciting, and I know there are probably more exciting things coming up because there's a major conference coming right up after Thanksgiving, the Clinical Trials on Alzheimer's Disease Conference. I'm wondering, you've given us maybe a little preview of the research that might be coming, but tell us about what you'll be presenting and if there are additional outcomes of this conference that you're looking forward to.
Sure. Well, being a geriatrician, I've been interested in aging most of my professional life. And I kind of recognized or thought early on that Alzheimer's disease is a disease of aging and old age. And we've known there's been research going on about the biology of aging for over 100 years. But we didn't ever really translate that knowledge into developing therapeutics for Alzheimer's. So things like inflammation, which is a hallmark of aging, is also seen in the aging brain and in Alzheimer's disease. And indeed, inflammation is recognized as one of the causes of the progression of Alzheimer's disease, even in people that have the simple pathology of beta amyloid plaques. So our strategy has been to translate this knowledge about the biology of aging into new therapeutics. And for the first time, we're going to start to see, at this conference, a result of that therapeutics research where we're chairing a session. I'm chairing a section, for example, called Beyond Amyloid. We want to go beyond the drugs that have been tens of billions of dollars in development to remove the amyloid, which is one theory, beyond the tau, which is the other pathology, and look at things like neuroinflammation and vascular problems and metabolic problems like diabetes that we mentioned, and how we can improve that in the aging brain. And we're going to hear at this conference coming up of these novel trials and the early results of these novel trials trying to reduce the amount of neuroinflammation in the brain. There's a gene called TREM2, which has been recognized. And so that's one, I think, exciting reports that we're going to start to hear about. Metabolic disturbances, repurposing diabetes drugs for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease is a very exciting field right now. The brain is dependent on glucose for its energy. If we have reduced glucose availability in the brain, then neurons get sick and die. There's insulin resistance with aging. It's part of aging. And so drugs like metformin, for example, which is the leading drug for diabetes, is now being repurposed for the treatment and prevention of Alzheimer's. And our foundation is supporting a large prevention trial out of Finland where lifestyle intervention, comorbidity management of diabetes and hypertension, and the addition of metformin as a drug sort of parallels the way we prevent heart disease these days. Lifestyle management, exercise, and diet and sleep and so on, reduce stress, manage your diabetes and hypertension, and take a statin. So our way of kind of mimicking that, if you will, or using that model will be a randomized clinical trial of prevention, seeing if metformin adds on to that by reducing insulin resistance. And we're going to hear about that at the meeting. So for the first time, it's going to be a meeting where we're going to have positive results from clinical trials. And I've been going to this meeting for, 30 years. We're going to have positive results from clinical trials. We're going to see a lot of clinical trials that are non-amyloid, non-tau, non-traditional interventions from many different companies, small biotechs and academia. And everybody, I think we're really excited about this meeting, and there's a lot of excitement in the field, and we're going to see a lot of reports.
Yeah. Well, I want to tell you, Dr. Fillit, I think you are doing a tremendous job for the people who will see and listen to this session of injecting hope where there hasn't really been a lot of hope about new things on the frontier. But let me just ask you about one group that I don't think we've talked about, and that is, I think we've all known people or had friends, colleagues, relatives with a young diagnosis of Alzheimer's. People under 65, I think, is the category of early onset. Is the search for solutions any different for this group than it is for the older population? Is there, having heard all of your comments so far, is there a different biomarker that we're looking at, or what is different about this group?
Well, it's rare to see Alzheimer's disease under 65. And I've had families from South America come visit me where everyone in the family got Alzheimer's in their 30s and 40s. And these are genetic mutations. They're rare. but they cause Alzheimer's. And many of the mutations are in the beta amyloid gene. Some of them are in the tau gene, but these are rare. So they're teaching us that these proteins play a role because alterations, mutations in the genes that code for these proteins cause Alzheimer's disease. But it's not the same illness as sporadic illness in old age, in my opinion, because the sporadic form of the disease, like other diseases of old age and aging, have multiple causes, and particularly lifestyle and comorbidity as part of the cause. Whereas, you're taking a healthy 30, 40-year-old and seeing them develop cognitive decline, there's one issue there, which is the mutation. So you can't necessarily translate what's going on in these genetic mutations to people that have sporadic Alzheimer's because the difference in the causes are so different. But I think we have learned a lot from people that have these mutations around the world to tell us what we should be looking for. And so it is unfortunate, and I've seen people in my practice in their 40s and 50s with Alzheimer's. It's very, very tragic, but it's actually quite rare.
Doctor, you're a very busy man. You operate a limited clinical practice, as you noted earlier, in addition to your duties of running the ADDF. And as we started off the show, we mentioned that we're in the holiday seasons. Maybe what's some good advice for noticing and dealing with any changes we might see in our relatives around the Thanksgiving time?
Sure. Well, of course, memory is a primary issue, but the way it manifests, for example, at Thanksgiving dinner, is that mom might ask you, like, what are we doing tomorrow? And you'll say, well, we're getting together over at sister's house tomorrow. And then 5 or 10 minutes later, mom might say, what are we doing tomorrow? And that's kind of out of the ordinary. That's not just a scheduling issue. So, very obvious sort of memory problems, particularly short-term memory, not long-term memory. Mom will remember when sister was 2 years old and that wonderful day that they had, but she might not remember what you told her 5 minutes ago. Mom might be the person who's hosting Thanksgiving dinner, and she's cooked Thanksgiving dinner for the last 20, 30 years, and now suddenly she's having trouble cooking. Or she forgets to put the right ingredients into the turkey or the mashed potatoes. These kind of functional deficits that we see that are so obvious, that would be an indication of an alteration in function, which is the result of cognitive impairment. Another thing is loss of emotional control and executive function, what we call executive function, which is very common in the early stages of the disease at a stage where we call now mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. And MCI is characteristically a stage where there's memory disorders, again, short-term, but also loss in what we call frontal executive functions. For example, loss of emotional control, change in personality. So in the past, mom might have been the peacemaker at the dinner table when everybody else is fighting. And now she's kind of lost control of her own emotions. And that's a change in personality for mom or dad. And I think that would be another sign that I would be worried. And if you combine them, usually these things occur together. Word finding is common with old age. So, having trouble remembering or recalling or using words is common. Remembering names is common, but forgetting the name of your daughter would not be common. So there's a difference. People always ask me, well, I'm having trouble retrieving words. Well, that happens with old age, but when it gets into the ability to recognize or remember the name of a loved one that you've known for 40, 50 years, that would be a problematic sign for me. And I think under any of these circumstances, a person should probably be brought to primary care or to neurology care just to get some simple cognitive testing that can take 10, 15 minutes and see if there's something going on. So we can get the early recognition, we can do the advanced care planning, we can do the financial planning, but most importantly, we can understand what's going on with mom and help her to get through this horrible disease.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fillit, for your very important work, for sharing this time with us. And thank you to our audience for being here. You can learn more about Conversations on Healthcare. Sign up for emails at chcradio.com. Dr. Fillit, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.